I Work Nights at a Haunted Hospital, written by Groovy Turtle. A lot of people hate night shifts. I remember that I had a colleague once who joked that he could never be Batman because after 10 at night, he was useless. Me, I never had that problem. You know that person who can go to sleep at the drop of a hat whenever they please? You see them on the train or a plane, it's like they have some magical switch in their brain that can just power down. Well, that's me. When you have the coveted power to go to sleep on command, you learn how to put it to use. For me, that meant signing up for night shifts. Let me back up. I'm a doctor, and during medical school, residency, and, to be honest, pretty much every other job I've worked before then, I always did my best to get late and night shifts. The vibe is a bit more relaxed, and the money is usually a bit better. As it turns out, the same is true in the medical field. What's more, being the night doc means that you can pretty much walk into any hospital and get a job. And that is pretty much what I did after I finished training. I had offers throughout the country, and I wound up picking up a gig in Chicago at a hospital that has been operating more or less consistently since about 1890. In terms of the patient population, it's like any other major city. Diseases, drugs, knives, and guns. I started working pretty shortly after I signed my contract. It didn't take me long to sink into a routine, and just as I hoped, the vibe was chill. I mean, as chill as a Chicago hospital at night can be. The people were welcoming, and I even made a few friends. One of the senior maintenance staff was named Forrest, but I always called him Mr. Jinx. I called him that because whenever he was around, I knew that the night was going to be bad. Well, the night everything started to go strange started like most others. I walked in as the sun was already setting, winter in Chicago, and when I saw Forrest, I already knew that it was going to be a busy night. Well, I set up shop in the on-call room after meeting with the nurses, and I waited and waited, but nothing came. I woke up at 3 a.m. to an admission. As I was walking to see the new addition to the ward, I caught a glimpse of an elderly woman in what looked like a torn hospital gown at the end of a hall as she turned the corner. Now, this isn't the first confused patient that I've had to run down. Given that I had the advantage of being young and not hospitalized, I figured that I'd catch her after I turned the corner. As I turned the corner, I came upon another empty hallway. Except, there was a smell. No, smell isn't the right word. It was a foulness permeating the air. It smelled like burnt flesh, horrifically mixed with sulfur and a strong smell of chemical cleaner. As almost an afterthought, I almost retched. I stumbled out of the vicinity of that horrendous reek, and after taking a few minutes to get myself together, I took care of our new admission and limped through the night despite that vile stink still being fresh in my mind and the wayward patient. On my way out that day, I saw Mr. Jinx and I mentioned that smell to him. He looked at me like I had 2 heads and 3 noses between them. All he said after that was, "Hey doc, a stink like that in my hospital, I'd know about it." I smiled and played it off like it was nothing. On the train home, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the hallway. Had I imagined her? The only thing that I knew was that there was no way that I could have imagined that filth permeating the air. I got to my apartment, and despite the night that I had just had, I was asleep a second after my head hit the pillow. I rarely remember my dreams, and when I do, there's not much detail, and it's almost like watching a movie. But today was different. It was more abstract. I dreamt of fire. I felt it wash across my face, burning and scalding as it danced along my skin. I felt fragile and helpless, And just when I thought the nightmare couldn't get any worse, the smell returned in full force, even more monstrous than the first time. Mercifully, I woke up in my bed covered in sweat. I looked at my clock and I realized that the entire dream had taken less than 20 minutes. And for the first time in my entire life, I couldn't go back to sleep. After my nightmare and my realization that I was not going to get back to sleep, I tried everything I could to pass the time and not think about the events of last night. I played video games, I ran, I meditated, I watched YouTube. Eventually, I realized it was time to get ready for work. Like I said before, I've never really had a problem sleeping, so sleep deprivation for me, despite going through training, wasn't exactly an old friend. As I groggily walked in the sliding doors, I was thrilled not to see the otherwise friendly smile of Mr. Jinx. I thought to myself that maybe tonight will be a bit more chill and I can get back on track and forget everything. I was wrong. The action started up almost immediately between admissions coming in hot from the ER and patients on the wards needing attention. I don't think I stopped moving until about 2 in the morning. Because of how busy I was, I didn't have any memories of any patients that stood out in my mind, except one. I think I remembered her because she was the patient I was about to admit before the events of last night. The nurse taking care of her that night asked me to take a look at her because she didn't look right. I remembered eyeballing the patient and thinking that the nurse was absolutely right. I examined the patient's chart. The modest antibiotic regimen that I had put her on had been replaced by a cocktail so aggressive that it could have knocked out God. And despite that, the patient still looked the worse for wear. I made a mental note to check on her again in a few hours. With this last bit of work done, I finally had a moment to breathe. And as I was walking towards the call room, I realized that I was right by the corridor where I allegedly spotted that phantom patient and was exposed to that noxious smell. Unfortunately, my curiosity got the better of me and I turned away from the call room towards that hallway, feeling a combination of anxiety and dread in my stomach. I spun around the corner and, to my relief, saw nothing. And the only smell I smelt was the disinfecting agents that Forrest had used to clean the floors. I looked around, looking for anything even slightly out of place, and found nothing. I shrugged, and once again I headed for the call room. Once I was in the call rooms, I placed my pager on the table, and begging it to stay quiet for even 20 minutes, I climbed into bed. As my eyes slowly shut, I was met with a blinding headache and the same excruciating burning sensation from my dream. I sat up and sprinted to the bathroom, hoping that cold water on my face would give me even a little relief. As I ran for the bathroom, I was blindsided by that smell of burnt flesh, singed hair, and sulfur, which stopped me in my tracks. My eyes were already watering from the burning on my face, the splitting headache rattling my skull, and when the stench hit, it was a coup d'etat. I remember losing my footing and opening my eyes a split second later, only to see the silhouette of a slim woman in the old hospital gown leaving the room and walking straight through the closed door of the call room. I tried to get up and follow her, which was much more difficult than I thought it would be. By the time I was on my feet and through the call room door myself, the only thing left was that grotesque odor. Mercifully, my head and face both felt better. The rest of that night was a blur. I made it through, and on my way home, I heard one of the security guards say that he'd seen George Romero movies where the monsters looked more lively than me. I wanted to argue the point, but one look at my reflection on the polished windows of the sliding doors at the exit sign showed me just how right the guard was. To add insult to injury, I missed my train home by a minute. I knew it only meant that I'd have to wait maybe 15 minutes for the next one, but after such a high-intensity night, with yet another unexplained and now painful phenomenon that I just wanted to be home in my bed. Resolving myself to this fate, I sat down on a cold bench and closed my eyes. In my dream, I was back in the fire. The burning sensation on my face and smell had both returned in full force. However, now the headache I first had in the call room was present, and every moment the flames engulfed me, the headache ramped up. As this was happening, I heard what I can only describe as a high-pitched beeping electrical sound, which made the burning, the smell, and the shooting pain in my head even worse than I could have possibly imagined. At the peak of this excruciating dream, I shot awake just in time to see my train pull into the station. I had been asleep for less than 15 minutes. Boarding the train, I felt something wet on my face. I touched my cheeks and realized that I had been crying in my sleep. I got off the train and walked towards my apartment. As I rode the elevator up to my floor and got off, I couldn't begin to describe the level of fatigue that I felt. A headache, which I can only describe as the residue of the nightmare that I had at the train station, still lingered in my head. And the cold air of the walk from my train stop to the apartment had gotten my eyes watering again, and I couldn't help but feel like I was right back in that horrific nightmare. As I stumbled towards my bed and looked at what once was a warm and welcoming sanctuary, I could feel only terror. I just couldn't bring myself to lie down, let alone sleep. Despite how drained I felt, I stood up, put my shoes back on, and walked out my door, down the elevator, and back outside. I began walking, and despite how cold it was, there was something comforting about walking. This was something I could control, one foot in front of the other, left then right. I walked for hours. The wind went right through my jacket, chilling me to my core. Despite this, I kept walking. I asked myself, am I going crazy? Is it possible to completely lose it in less than a week? Is this going to be the rest of my life? Can I even call this a life? Round and round the questions swirled in my head, and still I walked. I walked until my feet blistered and my knees ached, and somehow I wound up back at my apartment as the sun was beginning to set. I checked my phone and realized that my shift would be starting soon. In a way, it was almost a relief to be so fatigued because I just didn't have it in the tank to be scared or anxious. After a shower and a few cups of coffee and an attempt to eat something, which failed miserably, I'd love to say that I felt halfway decent. But realistically speaking, now I was a clean, sleep-deprived wreck with a caffeine buzz. Looking back on all of this, I should have called the hospital and told them that I was sick. I wasn't in a headspace to take care of myself, let alone do my job. I remembered that I had the following night off, and I decided to power through it. I told myself, I'll get through this shift, and no matter what, I'll crash when I get home. As I walked through the doors, I found myself hoping, almost praying, that whatever happens tonight, let it be, if not normal, then at the very least explainable. The night began and I started working. The combination of coffee and adrenaline somehow kept me limping along. I avoided the call room. I avoided that corridor. I felt like the coyote in the old cartoons that could run on thin air so long as he didn't look down. It was about 3 in the morning when the nurse from last night told me that our patient, who didn't quite look right, hadn't gotten any better. I looked at the patient's chart, and if she was on enough antibiotics to punch out God last night, well, she was now on enough antibiotics and other medication to drop an entire pantheon. Despite this, somehow, she seemed stable, at least on paper. I walked into her room scared of what I might see. An old mentor told me that a hospital is where you go when you need tubes and wires. If I had been my old self, I wouldn't have given her appearance any thought beyond its clinical significance. As I stared at the poor sleeping woman, electrodes on her chest, rigid plastic tubes in her nose, large IVs bulging out of both of her swollen arms, and a Foley bag attached to her bed filled with dark urine. Despite my fatigue, or maybe because of it, I felt frail and naked. I was brought back to my senses when I stared at the heart monitor over her bed, demonstrating a calmingly reassuring set of green waves that danced consistently across the screen. She certainly wasn't okay, but she was stable. As I turned to leave, a wave of nausea hit me so fast that I didn't even register the smell that caused it. A pain I can only describe as nails on the inside of my skull digging their way to freedom joined the nausea. And as the all too familiar burning in my face began, I attempted to leave the room, and as I stumbled blindly to the door, I came face to face with the specter that had been haunting me for the last 2 nights. There she stood, in what I thought was a hospital gown, but was actually an old burned and tattered dress. She stood about the same height as I did, but her face was horrifically burned. The top right half of her face was burned clean through to her skull, with a charred brown eyeball trembling within her eye socket. Below that, her cheekbone was completely visible save for a few strips of seared flesh. Her nose had been burned completely off, giving way to deep black schisms in the center of her face. Her upper lip had been completely burned away, giving her the appearance of a perpetual sneer, with her lower lip dangling from her mouth. Her left side had fared slightly better with some intact skin, enough for me to realize that she couldn't have been more than 40 years old. Her other crimson red eye stared right into both of my eyes as she began to move towards me. As she reached out for me with a clawed talon which vaguely resembled a hand, she opened her mouth, and from her mouth, that terrible electronic beeping from my dream began to resonate through the room and the hall. For a moment, it seemed familiar, and as I recognized it as a monitor alarm, my terror and confusion were interrupted by a loudspeaker.
Code Blue, room 217. Repeat, code Blue, room 217.
It took me a moment to remember where I was, but I whipped around to stare at the telemetry monitor, which only seconds ago projected stability. In its place was a flat line. The patient's heart had stopped. I froze. Between this and the horrific thing that I believed was behind me, I froze. I was ashamed to say that it was like my legs were welded to the floor. Thankfully, my paralysis was broken by the nursing team charging in and beginning CPR. I turned back around, but that thing was gone. By some miracle, and this return to a caricature of normalcy, I was able to assist the team. We were able to get the patient back from the brink. In the ICU, we learned that the patient had developed a large blood clot in her leg that had traveled to her lung. Somehow, despite everything, this patient had survived. The rest of my shift was a blur. I felt drunk as I walked out of the exit and shambled towards the train station. Remembering my dream from yesterday, I elected to remain standing. As I got off the train and into my apartment, I stared at my bed. There would be no avoiding it today. No trying to outwalk my fears. I didn't bother taking off my uniform, and I collapsed in my bed. There was fire. There were noxious smells. There was pain in my head. But even in the dream, I was too exhausted to care. And there, she was standing in front of me again. That same burned face. That burnt dress and those talons that might have been fingers at one time. Her one bloodshot eye stared straight into me, and then I saw the remaining part of her lower lip transforming her permanently sneering face into what might have been a smile. And just like that, the fire and pain were gone, and I felt myself floating in cool, empty darkness. I woke to the sound of my cell phone alarm, and disorientated, I lurched out of bed to turn it off, realizing with some pride that I had finally gotten some decent sleep. My disorientation only got worse when I stared at my phone. I realized that I hadn't slept for just the day, but rather a full 24 hours. The combination of the last several nights' events followed by about 24 hours of sleep left me with more questions than I could ever hope to answer. Who was she? Why was she there? Was I the only one who knew about her? Will this happen again? And are there more like her? I don't know that I'll ever get the answers to any of these questions, but I do know right here and right now, it's time to go to work.